Not every monster hides in the dark. Some wear ties and win on national television. It began like a story of triumph. Paul Curry was soft-spoken, clean-cut, and razor-sharp. He stood under the lights of Jeopardy in March 1989, calmly answering questions with the confidence of a seasoned intellect. He wasn't just good, he was charming. Over the course of 3 episodes, he claimed victory twice. He walked away with more than $24,000 and even won a brand new color television. But in his 3rd game, fate took a sudden turn. He entered Final Jeopardy with $5,000, just a few hundred behind the leader. The clue was simple, yet tricky. Though his 2nd administration was scandal-ridden, he was almost nominated for a 3rd term 4 years later. Paul guessed Andrew Jackson. That was wrong. The correct answer was President Ulysses Grant. He lost everything. His total dropped to 0, but Paul didn't flinch. He smiled, clapped politely, and walked off the stage with quiet dignity. What no one knew then was that behind his polished appearance, something darker was already taking shape. That same month, Paul Curry began a new job at a nuclear power plant, where he met Linda Kinkade, a brilliant and respected engineer in her mid-40s. She was confident, accomplished, and admired by everyone around her. Paul was 13 years younger, but he made Linda feel appreciated, supported, and deeply valued. He prepared meals for her, complimented her endlessly, and showed affection that seemed sincere. Friends were impressed by how devoted he appeared, often describing him as thoughtful, romantic, and almost too perfect to be real. And perhaps he wasn't. In 1992, the two were married in a quiet ceremony in Las Vegas, beginning what looked like the ideal love story. But things began to shift when Linda made a quiet phone call to her best friend, Mary Siebold. Her voice was hesitant. She explained that Paul had become increasingly focused on putting everything under his name: the house, the financial accounts, and even her life insurance. Linda had no idea that Paul Curry had a concealed history. He had already been through 2 marriages. He had a child he rarely acknowledged. And beneath his gentle demeanor, he carried a deep desire for control that was only just beginning to show. In an effort to bring back the warmth in their relationship, Paul surprised Linda with a 3-day cruise. It was meant to be romantic, a peaceful getaway, a chance to reconnect. On the surface, it seemed like a thoughtful gesture. But beneath that, it marked the beginning of something far more dangerous. During the trip, Linda, along with several other passengers, suddenly became ill. Doctors initially believed it might be a virus, possibly hantavirus. And while the others recovered quickly, Linda did not. Her energy never returned. She became exhausted, weak, and her condition grew worse with each passing week. Then, without explanation, her symptoms suddenly disappeared. She regained her strength and tried to move on with life. But the calm did not last. On New Year's Eve, 1993, just as the world was preparing to celebrate a new year, Linda collapsed. There were no warning signs, no cause. Her body simply gave out. And this time, whatever was happening inside her was not going to pass. Linda was rushed to the hospital, her body failing rapidly, and doctors were unable to explain why. Her organs were shutting down, but no one could find a clear cause. While medical teams worked to keep her alive, her best friend, Mary Siebold, grew suspicious. She began searching through Paul's home office. What she discovered sent a chill through her. There were files, forms, and insurance documents, all centered around Linda's finances, her life, and what would happen after her death. It was as if someone had been preparing for the end. Meanwhile, at the hospital, a nurse noticed something strange. Linda's forebag had a tiny puncture, so small it was almost invisible. It didn't come from any hospital procedure. Someone had deliberately tampered with it. Hospital security immediately alerted the police. Linda, slipping in and out of consciousness, was barely able to speak. But she managed to give detectives one name. In a whisper, she said, "Well, the only person I can think of that would have a motive to do it would be Paul. I just don't want to believe and think that he would do that. He seems like a very good husband." It was a heartbreaking confession. And just 6 months later, on June 10th, 1994, Linda Kinkade died. She was 49 years old. There was no official cause of murder. No one was charged. Paul Curry collected more than $400,000 in insurance payouts and retirement benefits. And after that, he disappeared from California without a trace. After Linda's death, Paul Curry disappeared. He left behind the sunny streets of California and reappeared in the quiet town of Salina, Kansas. There, he seemed to transform. No longer the brilliant nuclear engineer, no longer the charismatic game show winner. He now worked as a simple building code inspector. He bought a modest house. He married again. He kept to himself. Neighbors described him as polite but distant, someone who never shared too much and never talked about where he came from. For almost a decade, Paul Curry lived in the shadows, avoiding attention, avoiding questions. The money from Linda's death quietly supported his new life. And it seemed, for a time, that he had escaped justice entirely. No one came knocking. No one asked why a man with a brilliant mind had chosen to vanish into obscurity. But cold cases never truly close. And one detective, hundreds of miles away, was about to reopen the door Paul thought he had locked forever. In 2002, deep in the archives of the Orange County Sheriff's Department, Sergeant Yvonne Scholl pulled out the cold case file of Linda Kinkade. Something about the way the case had ended never sat right with her. There was fear in Linda's voice from that hospital bed, a fear that had gone unanswered. Sergeant Scholl reviewed every detail. She listened to the old recordings. She watched Linda's quiet plea, her hesitant accusation. And then, she started digging into Paul Curry's past. What she found was alarming. One of Curry's former wives agreed to speak with her. The story she told was all too familiar. For over a year, the woman had suffered from strange, unexplained symptoms. She was dizzy, weak, and often too exhausted to get out of bed. Dozens of doctors ran tests, but none could find the cause. Then, when she refused to take out a life insurance policy naming Paul as the beneficiary, he left her without warning. Just like that, he vanished from her life. And just like before, not long after, he found Linda. For Sergeant Scholl, the pattern was undeniable. Paul Curry had not just been unlucky in love. He had been testing his plan, perfecting his method, and leaving behind a trail of women who were sick, confused, and nearly silenced forever. By the early 2000s, technology had advanced, and new toxicology tools offered detectives the chance to re-examine old evidence. Sergeant Yvonne Scholl and her team requested that Linda Kinkade's preserved tissue samples be tested once more. What they uncovered was shocking. Linda had died from acute nicotine poisoning. This wasn't from cigarettes. It was pure, concentrated nicotine, the kind used in laboratories for pesticides. Lethal, even in small doses. Linda had never smoked a day in her life. Investigators concluded that Paul had been poisoning her slowly over time, possibly using tobacco extract mixed into the salads he lovingly prepared for her. He had cooked for her, served her, and watched her eat. They believed that in the final hours of her life, he delivered one last, fatal dose directly into her bloodstream, through the IV line at the hospital. That tiny puncture the nurse had noticed years earlier, the one dismissed at the time, was no accident. It was the moment the murder was committed. And finally, after nearly a decade in the dark, the truth had a voice. In November of 2010, Paul Curry was arrested and brought back to California to face questioning. After 16 years of freedom, the man who once stood smiling on the Jeopardy stage now sat across from detectives in a sterile interview room. His demeanor was unsettling, calm, too calm. When asked about the night Linda died, he spoke with practiced precision.
She came home from work, maybe around 6 o'clock. I had dinner ready, but she didn't really want it. She said she was tired, wanted to take a bath and go to bed, so she went to bed pretty early. I don't remember what time I woke up exactly, maybe around 11. It was Scabby, our black and white cat. He was making a strange noise, not like anything I'd ever heard from him before. Almost like he was scared or feral. He was right there, beside her. I tried to wake her up, but she wouldn't respond. I didn't know what to do. I checked her, tried to revive her, grabbed the cordless phone and called 911. I started CPR and kept going until they arrived. They came fast, took over, tried everything. I thought they were making progress. A sheriff deputy arrived too. He asked for phone numbers and went to get my neighbor Steve. Steve came over and went with me to the hospital. It was already after midnight. We waited, and then the doctor told me they couldn't revive her. He said she probably never woke up.
There was no emotion, no hesitation, no cracks in his story. But when detectives played the recording of Linda's final words, the moment she softly named Paul as the only person who might have a reason to harm her, he didn't react, he didn't argue, he didn't deny. He just sat there in silence, his face blank, as if the words held no weight. It was the silence of a man who still believed he was in control, but that control, piece by piece, was slipping away. On September 30th, 2014, inside a crowded Orange County courtroom, the trial of Paul Curry began. The prosecution laid out a chilling case. They argued that from the moment Paul met Linda Kinkade, he had begun weaving a web of manipulation and deceit. It wasn't a marriage, it was a plan, a long con, built on charm, secrecy, and the promise of love. For years, he had pretended to be the perfect husband, all while slowly and methodically poisoning the woman who trusted him most. They showed the jury the documents he prepared, the life insurance policies he pressured Linda to sign, the evidence of nicotine poisoning, the punctured IV line, the testimony from his previous wife. Each piece alone was disturbing. Together, they painted a portrait of a cold, calculating killer. The jury didn't take long. They found Paul Curry guilty of first-degree murder with special circumstances and insurance fraud. On November 14th, he was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. As the sentence was read, he stood motionless. The same unsettling calm he had carried for decades now met with finality. Prosecutor Ibrahim Beatty later said, "For 16 years, Paul Curry enjoyed the belief that he had committed the perfect crime. That belief," he said, "was shattered in that courtroom. For years, Paul Curry believed he had outsmarted everyone. He had the charm, the intelligence, the patience, and the arrogance. He played the long game, and for a time, it worked. He gained Linda's trust, he gained her love, and in the end, he gained her life insurance payout. But every perfect crime has its flaw. Sometimes it's a whispered name from a hospital bed. Sometimes it's a tiny puncture in an IV bag. Sometimes it's the sound of a cat crying in the middle of the night. Paul Curry had once stood on national television answering questions for money. But in the final round of his life, the answer he gave cost him everything. Not just his freedom, but the illusion he had built that he was smarter than the system, smarter than the truth, smarter than justice. In the end, it was Linda's quiet voice, a determined detective, and a trace of poison invisible to the eye that brought it all crashing down. He thought he had written the perfect ending, but the real story had only just begun.